forced to marry the man who murdered her father. A Lakota chief heard her and made it right. The pipe had gone cold an hour before I noticed. I was sitting at the edge of the fire pit, the bowl resting in my palm, and the tobacco had gone to ash without me drawing a single breath from it. That happens to me sometimes still, even now. I'll be somewhere and the world will go quiet and I'll look down and my hands will be holding something that has become useless and I won't know how long I let that time pass. My son thinks it means I'm getting old. He's wrong. It means I'm thinking. That night I was thinking about a treaty. The treaty was written in English, which I read, and in a kind of legal language that was written to look like fairness but was built from the bones of something else entirely. I had read it 4 times that day. Each time, I found something new to be angry about. The 4th time, I found the clause that concerned the land along the Cheyenne River, the flat grazing land that 3 Lakota families had worked for 11 years, and I understood what Harlan Goss intended to do with it. Harlan Goss. If I say his name with any particular feeling, I will tell you now it is not the feeling I want to spend time on. He was a man who built things. Roads, contracts, fences. He built things in the way a man builds a fire on someone else's floor, useful to him, catastrophic to everyone else. He had the governor's ear because he had the governor's money, which is to say he had bought the governor's ear a number of years prior and considered it his property. He wore good boots. He kept his beard trimmed. He smiled often. I mistrusted him from the first hour. But that night I was not thinking about Harlan Goss directly. I was thinking about the treaty and the clause, and what I would have to give away and what I would refuse to give away, and how those 2 things were going to require a fight that I was tired in my bones just thinking about. I am not a young man. I was not young even then. I had been fighting this particular kind of fight, papers, words, the slow theft conducted in daylight, for longer than some of my younger warriors had been alive. The fire had gone low. The camp was quiet. Most of the lodges had their fires banked for the night. I could hear the river. And then I heard something else. It was not a large sound. It was a woman's breathing, the kind that is controlled too tightly, the way you breathe when you do not want to be heard crying. My ears are still good. I have always had good ears. I heard her and I sat still and waited, because sometimes a person standing just outside the light needs a moment before they can come forward. She came forward. Her name was Winona Eagleheart. I knew her face. I knew her father better. A good man named Thomas Eagleheart who had been a bridge between our people and the few decent whites in the territory for 30 years. He worked horses. He had a laugh that filled a room. He had been dead for 6 months, and I still half expected to see him ride into camp on that dun gelding he kept. Winona was maybe 22. She had her father's eyes. She stood at the edge of my fire circle and she was wearing a dress I didn't recognize, not her own. Something too large, something borrowed or grabbed in a hurry, and there was a bruise along her left jaw that she had not tried to hide. I set the pipe down. I said, "Come sit." She sat, not close to me but close enough to the fire that I could see her clearly. She sat the way a person sits who is not sure whether they are welcome, keeping her weight forward, ready to stand again. I did not say anything else for a while. I picked up a stick and moved some of the coals around. The fire brightened a little. She said, "I did not know where else to go." I said, "You came to the right place. Tell me what happened." She told me. It took a long time. Not because the story was complicated, the story was very simple, the kind of simple that makes your stomach heavy, but because she had to stop several times and gather herself, and I did not rush her. I am, my son will tell you, a man who has never been good at waiting for smaller things. A horse to be saddled, a meal to be ready, a meeting to come to order. But I have learned to wait for the important things. I have learned that, when someone is finding the words for something that has cost them greatly, you wait. Her father had been killed 6 months ago. I knew this. What I did not know was that there had been a witness. There had been a witness. An old trapper named Corvin, who worked the creek line north of the Goss property. Corvin had seen two men ride up to Thomas Eagleheart on the road between the trading post and the reservation boundary, and he had seen what happened next, and he had seen one of those men's faces clearly in the afternoon sun. The face had belonged to a man named Del Purdy. Del Purdy worked for Harlan Goss. Winona had learned this 3 weeks ago, when Corvin, old, scared, drinking too much, had told her at the trading post because the weight of it had become more than he could carry alone. She had gone to the territorial marshal. The territorial marshal had listened to her, written something down, and sent her away. 2 days later, Corvin had gone missing. She did not think he had simply left. And then, 8 days ago, Harlan Goss had come to her uncle, her father's brother, the man who was now her closest living male relative, with a proposal. The proposal was this: Del Purdy wished to marry Winona Eagleheart. Goss presented it as an honor, an alliance, a way to put the unpleasantness of Thomas Eagleheart's death behind everyone. He brought money, not a bride price, that is not the word I would use. It was a payment, the kind designed to look like generosity but which both parties understood as the closing of a mouth. Her uncle had agreed. Winona had said no. She had said no twice. She had said no until the word ran out of anything behind it, because the world she was standing in had stopped listening to the word. The wedding was in 12 days. She had walked 4 miles in the dark to get to my fire. I sat with what she had told me for a long time. I did not speak. The fire went from bright to low again. At one point I got up and added wood to it, and she watched me do that, and when I sat back down she looked a little less like she was about to run. There is a thing that happens when you have sat with as much grief as I have sat with, when you have watched the slow grinding down of your people, treaty by treaty, year by year. There is a point at which you become either numb to it or you become something else. Something harder, not cold, harder. The way a blade is harder than the steel it was made from because it has been worked and shaped and all the softness has been pressed out. I was thinking about Thomas Eagleheart, his laugh, his done gelding, the way he used to shake hands, not the white man's quick grip, but the full press, palm to palm, looking you in the eye. I was thinking about the treaty I had been reading, the clause about the Cheyenne River land. The way Goss had been quietly buying up pieces of the territory for 2 years, and the way those pieces always seemed to border ours, and the way the territorial marshal seemed to develop a particular kind of blindness whenever Goss's name came up. I was thinking about Winona sitting at my fire with a bruise on her jaw that had not been there a week ago. All of these things were related. That was what I understood sitting there in the dark. They were not separate problems. They were one problem, worn in many different faces. I said, "You will sleep here tonight. There is a lodge at the north end of the camp. It is empty. It is clean. Tomorrow morning you will eat with my family." She looked at me and something in her face went very still, the way a person's face goes still when they have been expecting to be sent away and have not been sent away. She said, "My uncle will come for me." I said, "He will not take you from this camp." She said, "Goss has men." I said, "I know how many men Goss has. I have been counting them for 2 years. She sat there for another moment, and then she did something I did not expect. She reached out and put her hand over mine, just briefly, just for a moment, the way you might steady yourself on a fence post when the ground is uncertain. Her hand was cold from the walk, and then she took it back. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me yet, go sleep." Her uncle came at first light. His name was Joseph Eagleheart, and I want to be fair to him, so I will say this. He was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, which in this part of the territory in those years were sometimes difficult to tell apart. He had a farm that was one bad season from failing. He had 3 children of his own. He had watched his brother die and had understood at some level that the death had not been random, and that the men who could do that kind of thing were the same men who held notes against his property. He came with his hat in his hands. Literally, He was standing in front of my lodge with his hat in both hands, working the brim. I had eaten. I had slept a few hours. I had thought about what I was going to say. I told him to come inside and sit down, and I gave him coffee, and I let him talk first. He talked about responsibility, about Winona's future, about the importance of keeping peace with the men who ran the territory now. He talked about it being a good match, a secure match. He could not meet my eyes while he said any of this. He was reciting something he had rehearsed on the ride over. I waited until he was done. Then I said, "Joseph, look at me." He looked at me. I said, "Thomas was my friend for 30 years. I danced at his wedding. I sat with him when your father died. I knew him. And I know you knew what kind of man your brother was, which means you know what kind of man Del Purdy is. And I think if you look at me right now and tell me you believe this marriage is what is best for Winona, something in your face will tell me that you do not believe it." He looked at me for a long time. He said, "I don't have a choice." I said, "I'm going to help you find one." He looked at his hat. He said, "Goss won't like it." I said, "Goss doesn't need to like it. He needs to understand that some things are not for sale and some people are not touchable. That is what I'm going to make him understand." Joseph was quiet. Then he said, "How?" I said, "Leave that to me. But you will need to do one thing. You will need to go to Goss and tell him that you have reconsidered, that you are exercising your right as the girl's guardian to withdraw the agreement, that no insult is meant, but that your family has decided this match is not suitable." Joseph's face did something complicated. He said, "If I do that, he'll—" I said, "He will be angry. Yes. And then I will be standing between you and his anger, and he will have to decide whether he wants to have that fight. I do not think he will want to have that fight." Joseph was quiet for a very long time. The coffee had gone cold in his cup, and he hadn't touched it. He said, "You do this for Thomas's daughter." I said, "I do it for Thomas, and I do it because it's right. Those two things point the same direction." He was quiet again, then he nodded, one slow nod. He picked up his hat. He said, "I'll go to Goss today." I said, "Tell him tomorrow. I need today first." What I needed today for was a rider. I sent a young man named Hawk Sitting, 20 years old, fast, trustworthy, not easily rattled, to ride to the county seat where a federal judge named Ambrose Llewellyn kept his office. Llewellyn was not a friend exactly, but he was a man who took the law seriously in the particular way that some older men take it seriously, as a personal affront when it is violated, almost as a matter of pride. He had clashed with Harlan Goss twice before on land matter disputes, and both times had ruled against Goss, and each time Goss had accepted the ruling with the kind of gracious public face that meant he was furious underneath. I sent Hawk Sitting with a letter I had written, and with instructions to wait for an answer. Then I sent for a woman named Agnes Two Knives, who was 60 years old and had been trading at the post for 35 of them, and who knew everything that moved through the territory: goods, money, gossip, men. She came to my fire at mid-morning, and I told her what I needed, which was everything she knew about Del Purdy. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in that flat way she has, "He beat a Mexican boy half to death outside the post 2 years ago. Goss paid the boy's family to disappear. Before that there was something in Wyoming, a dispute over mining rights, and a man ended up dead. Before that I don't know. He came with Goss when Goss arrived here, which means he came with the rest of Goss's problems." I asked her about the trapper Corvin. She said, "Nobody's seen Corvin since late October. His traps were found set and empty north of the creek. That's not how a trapper who is still alive leaves his traps." I asked about the marshal. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. I said, "I know, but how deep does it go?" She said, "Deep enough that I wouldn't send a complaint to his office. Not deep enough that he'd fabricate a crime against a sitting chief. He's bought, not brave." I thanked her. She went. I sat with what I had. What I had was a witness who was likely dead, a marshal who was owned, a federal judge who might act if given enough to act on, a treaty negotiation in which I held some cards that Goss needed, and Winona, who was safer in my camp than she had been in 4 days. I also had something else. I had been in this territory for 61 years. I had watched it change. I had shaken hands with 7 different governors and buried 4 of my closest friends and lost 2 sons to illness and watched the boundaries of what my people could call their own shrink and shrink like a piece of leather left in the sun. I had made agreements I didn't like and held my tongue at meetings where I wanted to put my fist through a table. I had been patient for a very long time. Patience is a thing I believe in, but it is not infinite and it is not weakness, and there are moments when the patient man takes what he has been quietly assembling and acts. This was one of those moments. Winona found me that afternoon at the corral, where I was working a young horse. She watched me for a while before she said anything. I knew she was there. I kept working the horse, a 3-year-old bay that had been spooked badly once and needed to be shown that not every movement was a threat. You cannot rush that kind of work. You have to let the animal come to understand on its own terms. She said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to make it so Goss has more to lose by holding on to this than by letting it go." She said, "You think that's possible?" I said, "Goss is a man who counts things. Every move he makes has a cost and a return. What he's done to your father, what he's planning with this marriage, it all has a cost and a return in his accounting. What I need to do is change the numbers." She was quiet. The bay moved sideways and I let it, kept my body still. She said, "My father used to say you were the most stubborn man he'd ever met." I said he was right. She said he meant it as respect. I said I know how he meant it. She was quiet again. Then she said, "The bruise on my jaw, it was Purdy 2 weeks ago at my uncle's farm. He came with Goss, they were presenting the arrangement and I said no and he grabbed my face and told me to think carefully. Goss stood there and watched. He did not tell Purdy to stop. I stopped moving, the bay settled. I said I know." She said, "I don't think you knew that." I said, "I know that men like Purdy do not know any other way to make themselves understood, and I know that Goss considers it useful." She said my father would have. She stopped. I waited. She said he would have come to you. He would have come to you that same night. He wouldn't have waited. I said no, he wouldn't have. She turned and walked back toward the lodges, and I watched her go, and the bay shifted under my hand, and I realized I had been gripping the lead rope too tight. I loosened my hand. I took a breath. There is a particular kind of anger that old men carry differently than young ones. Young men's anger wants to move immediately. It wants to become action before the thought is fully formed. Old men know better. Old men have made the mistake of moving before the moment was right and have paid for it. And so we learn to hold the anger and let it work for us instead of burning it up all at once. I held it. Hawk Sitting came back on the 3rd day. He brought a letter from Judge Llewellyn. I read it twice. The judge was interested. He was particularly interested in the disappearance of Corvin, because Corvin had in fact filed a deposition, written, sworn, with a post-settlement notary's mark, regarding the death of Thomas Eagleheart, 3 months prior to his disappearance, and this deposition had been submitted to the marshal's office and had apparently never been forwarded to the federal court as required. The marshal had sat on a sworn murder deposition for 3 months. That was not a small thing. That was a federal crime. I wrote back. I told Llewellyn what I had, what Winona had told me, and what I intended to do in the next several days regarding the treaty negotiations, in which the Cheyenne River land clause would need to be revisited. I told him that I believed the clause had been drafted in bad faith with Goss's involvement, and that if that could be demonstrated, the entire treaty would need to be renegotiated. Goss needed that treaty. He needed it for the railroad access rights. Without the treaty, the railroad spur that he had contracted to build, the one that would quadruple the value of every piece of land he'd been quietly purchasing, was a dead letter. I held the letter for a long time. Then I sent for Joseph Eagleheart. Joseph came the next morning and I told him everything. I told him about the deposition. I told him about the judge. I told him about the treaty clause. I watched his face go through several things: disbelief, then the particular stillness of a man who is revising his understanding of his situation. He said, "You've been putting this together since she came to your fire." I said, "I've been putting some of it together for 2 years. Your niece gave me the final piece." He said, "If Goss finds out what you know." I said, "That's why you're going to him today, not tomorrow, today." He said, "And I tell him the arrangement is off." I said, "You tell him it is off, and you tell him that Winona has returned to her family's care, which is to say your care, and that the matter is closed. Nothing more. No accusations. No mention of depositions or judges. Just that you have reconsidered and the answer is no." Joseph said, "And when he pushes back?" I said, "If he is smart, he won't push. If he pushes anyway, you tell him that any pressure on this matter will be raised with me, and that my involvement in the treaty negotiation is currently ongoing." Joseph understood what that meant. He sat with it for a moment. He said, "And Purdy?" I said, "Purdy will be addressed separately." Joseph looked at me. He said, "By you?" I said, "By the federal court if things go as I hope, and yes, by me in the meantime." He nodded. He stood. He put his hat on. He said, "My brother Thomas, he trusted you absolutely. I never fully understood it. I always thought there was something almost reckless about it, trusting any one person that much." I said, "He was a good judge of people." Joseph said, "I think he was. I think I see it now." He said, "I'll go to Goss today." He left. I want to tell you about the evening before Joseph came back with word. Winona had been in the camp for almost a week at that point. She had helped with some of the younger children. She was good with children, easy and calm with them, the way her father had been easy with horses. She had helped Agnes Two Knives sort through some trade goods. She had not been idle, had not been waiting and doing nothing, which I noticed and respected. That evening she came and sat near my fire. Not asked permission, not waited to be invited, just came and sat, the way you sit with someone you have decided you can sit with. We were quiet for a while. She said, "Tell me about my father, when he was young." I said, "How young?" She said, "Before I was born." So I told her. I told her about the first time I had met Thomas Eagleheart. He had been maybe 18, lean, trying to grow a beard that wasn't quite happening, riding a horse he'd clearly just bought because it was too big for him, and he was having to work to keep it from going wherever it wanted. He had come to our camp with a message from the trading post, something routine, and he had stayed 3 hours because he'd gotten into a conversation with my father about horses, and my father had shown him the right way to sit the big horse. And by the time he left, the horse was moving beautifully under him, and Thomas had shaken my father's hand like they were old friends. I told her about the time, years later, when Thomas had ridden hard through a January storm to bring word that a party of surveyors with bad intentions were moving toward our winter camp. He had not had to do that. Nobody had asked him to do it. He'd done it because it was right, and because he considered us his people as much as he considered anyone his people. I told her about the laugh. She was quiet for a while after that. The fire was low. Somewhere in the camp a baby was crying and then was not crying. She said, "He talked about you sometimes. He said you were the truest man he'd ever known." I did not say anything to that. There is a category of thing that does not need a response. She said, "I want to ask you something." I said, "Ask." She said, "After this is over, if it goes as you think it will, what happens? I go back to my uncle's farm. Goss is still here. Purdy might be gone. but there are others like them. There will always be others like them. I said, yes. She said, so then what? I said, then we do the same thing again. We make it as costly as possible to wrong us. We build the alliances that make us harder to touch. We keep the records, the depositions, the letters, the witnesses. We don't let them rewrite the story. She said, that sounds like a lot of work. I said, it is. It is a lifetime of work. But I have been doing it for 40 years, and I will tell you that the position we hold today is different from the position we held then. It is not good enough. But it is different, and the difference was made by work. She was quiet. Then she said, I want to help with that work. I looked at her. She said, I can read and write in English. My father taught me. I understand the treaty language better than my uncle does. I'm not afraid of men like Goss, or I wasn't born afraid of them, and I'm not going to let him make me into someone who is. I want to be useful. I said, you already are. She said, more than this. I said, I know, I can see that. We'll find where you fit. She looked at me with her father's eyes, straight on, no hesitation in it. She said, I believe you. And the thing about being believed by a person who has reason to doubt, the thing about that is that it settles into you somewhere. Not loud, quiet. Like a coal in your chest that's been burning low, suddenly gets a breath of air. I picked up my pipe and found the tobacco and filled it. The night was cold. The stars were out, the big field of them, the way they look in the deep of winter. I thought about Thomas. I thought about the work still to do. I thought about 40 more years of the same fight, and about the fact that the fight was better when you had people beside you who understood what it was for. I lit the pipe. Joseph came to the camp the following afternoon. He had gone to Goss. He had delivered the message. And Goss, to his credit or his calculation, had done the smart thing. He had gone very still and quiet, and had asked Joseph twice to repeat himself, and then had said that he was disappointed and that he hoped there would be no hard feelings. No hard feelings. Joseph said he smiled when he said it. The whole time he was smiling, but his eyes weren't. I said no, they wouldn't be. Did he mention me? Joseph said, he said he looked forward to continuing the treaty discussions with you. He said it like it was a warning. I said, I know how he meant it. I thanked Joseph and let him go home. Then I sat and thought about what Goss would do next, which was the most important question. Goss would move carefully. He knew something had shifted. He could feel it the way you can feel a change in the wind before the storm comes in. He did not know about the deposition. He did not know about Llewellyn. He knew that I had put myself between him and Winona, and that meant the treaty negotiation which he needed was now tied to this situation, whether he wanted it to be or not. He had two options. He could try to force it, use his men, use his money, try to isolate me politically and proceed with the marriage by raw pressure. Or he could absorb the loss of the marriage arrangement, keep the treaty negotiation moving, and look for another way to neutralize me later. Goss was a man who counted things. He would count this and choose the second option. And while he was choosing the second option, the wheels I had set in motion with Llewellyn would be turning. That was the plan. Plans do not always proceed as designed. Del Purdy came to the edge of the camp 3 nights later. He came alone, which told me something about his judgment or his confidence or both. He came on horseback, and he stopped where the firelight ended and the dark began, and he called out my name. I came out of my lodge. I did not bring a rifle, which some of my younger men found puzzling. I walked to where he sat on his horse, and I looked up at him. He was a broad man, heavy through the shoulders, with a flat, square face that had been arranged by nature into an expression of mild contempt. He looked down at me the way men like him look down at men like me, with the particular confidence of someone who has spent their whole life having that confidence confirmed by the world around them. He said, "You've got something that belongs to my situation." I said, explain what you mean. He said, the Eagle Heart girl. The arrangement's already been made. I said, the arrangement was unmade 3 days ago by her guardian. Joseph Eagleheart withdrew his consent. The matter is closed. He said, the matter isn't closed until Mr. Goss says it's closed. I said, Mr. Goss's say doesn't reach into this camp. He looked at me for a long moment. He was deciding something. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his hand was resting near his hip without quite touching the gun. I said, I want to be clear with you about something. You are currently on my land. You came here uninvited in the night to make a threat. There are 12 men in this camp who are watching this conversation right now, and 3 of them have been to war and are considerably less patient than I am. I let that sit. I said, I also want to be clear that the Federal Circuit Court is currently reviewing a sworn deposition regarding the death of Thomas Eagleheart. That deposition names a man in Mr. Goss's employ. The deposition has been received by Judge Llewellyn, who is, I understand, a thorough man. Purdy's face changed. It did not change much. Men like him don't show a great deal on the outside. But something went through his eyes, not fear exactly, but the recalculation that happens when a man who thought he was holding all the cards discovers he is missing some. I said, I suggest you go back and tell Mr. Goss what I've told you. I suggest he consider his next step very carefully. The treaty negotiation continues as scheduled. I will be there. We will discuss the Cheyenne River Clause, which I have some concerns about. Those discussions will go better for everyone if there are no additional provocations. Purdy sat on his horse for another moment. Then he turned the horse around and rode out. I stood and watched him go until I couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. My son appeared at my elbow. He is 34 and he has my wife's eyes, and he has always been more cautious than I am, which I consider a virtue in a son. He said, that could have gone differently. I said, yes. He said, you weren't worried. I said I was worried, I just wasn't going to show it. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He said, Father. I said, go back to bed. He went. Llewellyn moved faster than I expected. He sent a federal marshal, not the territorial marshal, who was now the subject of his own investigation, but a deputy out of the federal office, to the territory within 10 days. The deputy came with warrants. The warrants named Del Purdy in connection with the death of Thomas Eagleheart. Purdy was arrested at the Goss property on a Tuesday morning. I heard about it from Hawk Sitting, who had ridden to town to watch. He said Purdy went quietly, which surprised him. I told him that men like Purdy go quietly when they know the game is up, because the calculation has changed, and the smart move is to preserve whatever margin remains. Goss would not be protecting Purdy now. Purdy had become a liability, and Goss was already working on how to distance himself. Goss was smart enough not to try anything. The treaty negotiation resumed the following week. I attended with 2 of my advisors. Goss attended with his lawyers. The room was very polite, very formal. The Cheyenne River Clause was raised by my side on the second day. I do not need to walk you through all of it. 3 days of argument, proposed amendments, revised language. What I will tell you is that the clause was rewritten. The grazing land stayed with the 3 Lakota families who had worked it for 11 years. Goss got the railroad access rights he needed, but on narrower terms than he'd hoped for, and with a provision that gave our people a stake in the freight revenue that crossed our land. It was not everything I wanted. It never is, but it was more than I had arrived with. I signed the new treaty on a cold Thursday afternoon in a room that smelled of wood smoke and old paper. Goss signed across the table from me. He did not look at me when we shook hands afterward. He shook my hand firmly and precisely and then turned to speak to his lawyer. I did not care whether he looked at me. Winona stayed in the camp for another 2 weeks after Purdy's arrest. There was no particular reason she had to stay, and no particular reason she had to go. Her uncle's farm was there, and her life before all this was still there if she wanted it. But she had said she wanted to help with the work, and I had said we would find where she fit, and I am a man of my word. During those 2 weeks she sat in on 2 council meetings and said nothing and watched everything, the way a person watches when they are learning how something works. She translated some correspondence. Her English was better than she had represented, which is to say it was very good, legal document good, the kind you don't get from a one-room schoolhouse. Thomas had taught her himself. I could hear him in the way she unpacked a sentence. On the day she was going to leave, she came to my lodge in the morning. I was outside, working on a piece of tack that needed mending. The light was early and thin, the kind of winter light that doesn't give much warmth but gives everything a clean edge. I could hear the camp waking up around me, the sounds I have heard every morning for 60 years, so familiar I sometimes stop hearing them until a morning like this one when something makes you pay attention. She stood there for a moment. She was wearing her own clothes now, the ones that fit, and her hair was braided back. The bruise on her jaw had faded to almost nothing. She said, "I want to thank you." I said, "You already thanked me." She said, "I know, I want to do it again." I kept working the tack. The leather was cold and stiff. She said, "My father would have wanted to be here for this. He would have been proud, not just of what you did, of the way you did it." I kept my hands moving. There is a particular kind of thing that lands hard in a man's chest when a child of a good friend says their father would have been proud of him. It lands in a place where you can't do much about it except keep your hands moving and your face steady. I said, "Your father was a better man than I gave him enough time to tell him." She said, "I think he knew." I said, "I think he did too." She stepped forward and she did something then that I did not expect, which is that she took hold of my hands, both of them, leather and all, and held them for a moment. Her grip was firm. She looked at me straight on, the same way she had looked at me that night by the fire when she'd said she believed me. She said, "What you did for me, and for him, I'm going to spend my life trying to deserve it." I said, "You don't owe me anything. You came to my fire when you had nowhere else to go, and you told me the truth and you trusted me. That's all I needed from you." She said, "I know, but I'm going to do it anyway." She let go of my hands. She stepped back. She said, "I'll come back in the spring if the offer to help is still open." I said, "The offer doesn't expire." She nodded. She turned and walked toward the horse her uncle had sent for her, and she mounted it cleanly, the way her father had always mounted, like someone who had been on horseback so long it was just an extension of walking. She rode out at a steady pace, not looking back. I watched her go. The leather was stiff in my hands. The morning light was thin and cold. Somewhere in the camp a fire was crackling and there was the smell of food starting, something with sage. I stood there for a while, longer than I needed to. There is a thing people get wrong about the men who do this work, the work of fighting slowly, legally, carefully in the long game. They think we are men without feeling, men who have turned themselves into instruments, men for whom the work has replaced the living. That is not how it is, or it is not how it has been for me. I have buried friends. I have buried sons. I have sat across tables from men who believed they owned the earth I was standing on and shaken their hands without letting my face show what I was thinking. I have done this for 40 years, and in all of that time, the thing that has kept me from becoming the hard, cold instrument that people imagine when they picture a man like me. It has been moments like the one at the fire, when Thomas Eaglehart's daughter sat across from me in the dark and told me the truth and trusted me with it. It has been knowing that the work is for something, not for a principle, not for an abstraction, for people, for the particular weight of a particular woman's hands on mine in the cold morning light. Her father's daughter. The spring will come. The work will continue. There is another clause in another treaty already being drafted somewhere by a man in good boots who smiles often. There will be another fight. But that morning, standing in the clean winter light, I held what I had done and let myself feel the weight of it for once, instead of setting it down and moving on. There are not so many moments in a life when you do exactly the right thing at the right time, and it is enough. That was one of mine. I went inside and ate breakfast. The fire was good and the food was warm, and outside the camp was alive with the sounds of morning, and I sat with it for a while before the day began. It was enough.